Right, so picture this. You are driving along a dual carriageway somewhere in Middle England, fuel light blinking, and you pull into a petrol station, fill your tank, walk inside, grab a sandwich and a coffee, tap your card, and drive away. The entire interaction lasting perhaps 7 minutes. And in that 7 minutes, you have just participated in one of the most deceptively complex, most structurally misunderstood, and most genuinely fascinating small business economics in all of Britain. Because nearly everything you assume about how that petrol station makes money, who actually owns it, and where the real profit sits within that transaction is almost certainly wrong. And understanding why it is wrong, understanding the actual mechanical economics underneath what looks from the outside like a straightforward, high-revenue business, is what this entire breakdown is about. Here is the number that breaks most people's mental model of this industry wide open before we even get started. That petrol station you just filled up had probably turned over somewhere between £2 and £5 million last year in total fuel sales alone. A revenue figure that sounds enormous. That sounds like the kind of turnover that should make the owner genuinely wealthy. And yet the actual gross margin the station earned on that fuel, the difference between what it paid for the petrol and what it charged you at the pump, was almost certainly somewhere between 3 and 7 pence per litre. A margin so thin that on a typical 50-litre fill-up costing you perhaps 80 or 90 pounds, the station itself earned somewhere between £1.50 and £3.50 in gross fuel profit before it paid a single penny of its own operating costs. That gap between the enormous headline revenue flowing through the pumps and the almost vanishingly thin margin the station actually captures from each litre sold is the single most important structural fact about this entire industry. And everything else this breakdown examines flows directly from it. And if this is the kind of structural, behind-the-scenes economic analysis that helps you understand how ownership and capital really work in Britain, this is exactly what the Money Framework British channel is built around. So subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Let us start with the ownership structure itself, because this is where the first and perhaps most important misconception needs correcting. When most people think about a petrol station, they assume the person running it owns the business in the same way a restaurant owner or a shop owner does, buying the product, setting the price, keeping the profit. The reality of UK petrol station ownership is considerably more complicated and considerably more varied than that. And understanding the different ownership models is essential to understanding where value actually accumulates in this industry. There are, broadly speaking, 3 distinct ownership and operating models coexisting across the roughly 8,000 petrol stations currently operating in the United Kingdom. The first is the company-owned, company-operated model, where a major oil company or a major supermarket chain owns both the site and the business outright, employing staff directly, setting prices centrally, and capturing all revenue and profit itself. These are not independent businesses at all. They are retail outlets of enormous corporations, and the person you see behind the counter is an employee, not an owner. The major supermarket forecourts, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrison's, overwhelmingly operate on this model, and they collectively account for a genuinely significant and growing share of total UK fuel sales, a share that has expanded steadily over the past 3 decades, as the supermarkets recognize that fuel sales drive footfall into their adjacent grocery stores, meaning they can afford to sell fuel at margins that would be economically suicidal for an independent operator, because the fuel is functioning partly as a loss leader for the vastly more profitable grocery operation sitting right next door. The second model is the company-owned, dealer-operated model, sometimes called a franchise or tenancy arrangement, where the oil company owns the physical site, the land, the forecourt, the tanks, and the canopy, but contracts with an individual dealer to operate the station on a day-to-day basis. Under this model, the dealer typically buys fuel exclusively from the owning oil company at a set wholesale price, sells it at a price that may be partly or wholly dictated by the company, and earns a commission or a small retail margin on each liter sold, while also operating whatever shop or ancillary business exists on the site, sometimes under the dealer's own control, sometimes under a tied arrangement with a specific convenience store brand the oil company has partnered with. This model gives the dealer operational responsibility and some degree of profit participation, but crucially does not give them ownership of the underlying site, meaning they are building a business on someone else's property, a structural dynamic this channel has examined across multiple other industries, and one that carries genuine, significant implications for long-term wealth accumulation. The third model is the genuinely independent, dealer-owned site, where an individual or a small company owns both the physical property and the business, purchases fuel on the open wholesale market from whichever supplier offers the best terms, sets their own retail prices, and operates their own shop and any other ancillary services entirely under their own control. This is the model that most closely resembles genuine independent business ownership. And it is the model where the actual economics of petrol station ownership become most clearly, most instructively visible. Because the independent owner bears the full weight of every cost, every risk, and every structural challenge this breakdown is about to examine without the corporate backing, the bulk purchasing power, or the cross-subsidy from adjacent grocery operations that the company owned and supermarket models benefit from. Now, the fuel margin economics in genuine detail. Because this is the mechanical heart of the entire business, and it is where most people's understanding goes most fundamentally wrong. When you see petrol priced at, say, 140 pence per litre on the forecourt sign, the breakdown of where that 140 pence actually goes is genuinely startling. Fuel duty, a flat-rate tax levied by the government on every litre of road fuel sold in Britain, currently accounts for just under 53 pence of every litre. VAT at 20% is then charged on top of the combined product cost and duty, adding a further significant chunk. The wholesale cost of the fuel itself, which fluctuates with global oil prices and refining margins, accounts for most of what remains. And after duty, VAT, and wholesale cost have all been subtracted, what is left for the retailer, the actual gross margin the petrol station earns for storing, handling, and selling that liter of fuel, is that 3 to 7 pence figure mentioned at the top of this breakdown. Let that structure sit for a moment, because it has profound implications for how this business actually works. More than half of the retail price of every liter sold is government tax, meaning the petrol station is, in functional terms, operating as an unpaid tax collection agent for the Treasury, handling enormous volumes of a hazardous, heavily regulated product, bearing all the operational risk of storing thousands of liters of flammable liquid on site, and earning a margin on each liter that is, in percentage terms, almost absurdly small, relative to the total value of the transaction. A typical independent petrol station, selling perhaps 3 to 5 million liters of fuel per year at an average margin of 5 pence per liter, generates somewhere between £150,000 and £250,000 in gross fuel profit, which sounds reasonable until you start subtracting the actual operating costs that gross figure has to cover. Staff costs, because a petrol station needs to be manned during all opening hours, and many now operate 24 hours, typically represent the single largest individual operating cost. Business rates on what is, by definition, a relatively large commercial site with significant forecourt area. Electricity costs, which are substantial given the need to power pumps. lighting across a large forecourt, refrigeration in the shop, and card payment systems that process thousands of transactions. Maintenance costs for the pumps, tanks, and forecourt surfaces themselves. Environmental compliance costs, because storing and dispensing large volumes of fuel on site triggers genuine, significant regulatory obligations around tank integrity monitoring, vapor recovery systems, and groundwater protection. Insurance costs that reflect the genuine, specific risk profile of a site holding tens of thousands of liters of flammable liquid. And, for a dealer-owned site, whatever mortgage or financing cost the owner is carrying on the property itself. When you subtract all of those costs from that 150 to 250,000 pound gross fuel margin, you begin to see why fuel sales alone, despite the enormous headline revenue they generate, simply cannot sustain a modern petrol station as a viable business. The fuel, that seemingly central product, the thing the entire business appears from the outside to exist in order to sell, is in many cases barely breaking even on its own. And in some periods, particularly when wholesale prices spike suddenly, and the station cannot immediately pass the full increase through to the pump price without losing customers to a cheaper competitor down the road. The fuel operation can actually lose money on a per-liter basis for days or weeks at a time. This is the structural reality that drives everything else about how a modern petrol station actually works. And it is the reason the shop, the thing most customers treat as an afterthought, a place to grab a bottle of water while the payment processes, has become not merely an important part of the business, but the actual primary profit center for a growing number of stations. The thing that actually determines whether the business is financially viable or not. The convenience retail operation inside a petrol station typically generates gross margins of 30 to 40% or more on the products it sells. A margin structure that is, by comparison with the 3 to 7% fuel margin, almost unimaginably generous. And it is this shop margin, applied across a product range that includes sandwiches, drinks, confectionery, tobacco, newspapers, and increasingly, a much wider grocery and food-to-go offer, that actually provides the profit the business needs to survive, and in the best cases, to thrive. If you are finding this breakdown valuable, if you want to understand the real economics behind the industries and businesses that shape British life, subscribe to Money Framework British right now, because this channel exists to give you exactly this kind of structural, honest analysis that you simply will not find anywhere else. Now, let us talk about the competitive dynamics, because they are genuinely brutal, and they have reshaped this entire industry almost beyond recognition over the past 30 years. The single most destructive competitive force facing independent petrol station owners in Britain has been the sustained, strategic expansion of supermarket fuel retailing. When Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, and Morrisons began installing petrol stations at their major stores from the early 1990s onward, they did so with an explicit, well-understood strategic purpose: using fuel as a traffic driver, pricing it at or near cost, sometimes genuinely below cost, in order to attract customers onto the supermarket site, where they would then spend money in the grocery store at margins that more than compensated for whatever was lost or merely broken, even on at the pump. This cross-subsidy model meant the supermarkets could sustain fuel prices that an independent station, dependent on its fuel margin for a meaningful portion of its total income, simply could not match over any sustained period. The result has been a decades-long structural consolidation of the UK petrol station market. In 1970, Britain had roughly 37,000 petrol stations. Today, it has approximately 8,000. That is a loss of nearly 30,000 sites in little more than 50 years. And while some of that decline reflects genuine rationalization of an oversupplied market, a very significant portion of it represents independent and small dealer-operated stations that simply could not survive in a competitive environment, where the dominant players were willing and able to sell fuel at margins no standalone station could sustain. Every closure represents not just a lost business, but a lost piece of community infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, where the nearest alternative station may be 10, 15, 20 miles away, and where the local petrol station often served as the last remaining retail presence in a village that had already lost its post office, its pub, and its local shop. Now, the capital requirements of actually owning and operating a petrol station, because this is where the business becomes genuinely, substantially capital-intensive in ways that are not at all obvious from the outside. The underground fuel storage tanks that sit beneath every forecourt have finite operational lives and must eventually be replaced, a process that involves excavating the forecourt, removing the old tanks, installing new ones that meet current environmental and safety standards, and reinstating the forecourt surface, a project that can cost several £100,000 for a typical site. The fuel dispensing pumps themselves require regular maintenance and periodic replacement. The point of sale and payment systems, tank monitoring and gauging equipment, CCTV and security systems all carry ongoing capital replacement costs. Environmental compliance, including the installation and maintenance of leak detection systems and vapor recovery equipment, adds a further genuine capital layer. And the shop fit-out itself. If the owner wants to compete effectively with the increasingly sophisticated convenience retail offers being rolled out by the major branded convenience chains, requires periodic, significant reinvestment. For a dealer-owned independent site, all of these capital costs fall directly on the owner, funded either from retained profits, which as this breakdown has documented are often thin, or from borrowing, which brings its own costs and risks. For a company-owned, dealer-operated site, the oil company typically bears the major infrastructure costs but recoups them through the tied supply arrangements and commission structures that limit the dealer's own margin upside. Either way, the capital intensity of maintaining a petrol station to modern standards is genuinely substantial, and it sits in persistent, uncomfortable tension with the thin margin economics this breakdown has been documenting throughout. There is an environmental and regulatory dimension that deserves direct attention, because it adds a further, genuine and growing cost layer that falls disproportionately on smaller, independent operators. The environmental liability associated with fuel storage and dispensing is real and significant. Historical fuel leaks from older underground tanks have contaminated land at a substantial number of UK petrol station sites, and the remediation cost for contaminated land, cleaning up petroleum hydrocarbons that have leached into soil and potentially into groundwater, can run to hundreds of thousands of pounds, sometimes more. This contamination liability attaches to the site itself, meaning a prospective purchaser of an independent petrol station must factor the potential cost of environmental remediation into their acquisition calculation, a cost that is often uncertain, difficult to quantify precisely without extensive testing, and potentially devastating if it proves larger than expected. This environmental liability overhang has, in practice, made selling independent petrol station sites genuinely more difficult and more complex than selling other comparable commercial properties, because the buyer is acquiring not just a business and a property, but a potential difficult-to-quantify environmental liability that could significantly exceed the purchase price itself. Now, the electric vehicle transition, because this is the single most significant long-term structural question facing every petrol station owner in Britain today. And its implications for the economics of station ownership are genuinely profound and still genuinely uncertain. The UK government has committed to banning the sale of new purely petrol and diesel cars from 2035, and the installed base of electric vehicles on British roads is growing rapidly, meaning the long-term demand trajectory for the core product that petrol stations have sold for a century is, beyond any reasonable dispute, downward. The question is how fast that transition proceeds, how completely it displaces petrol and diesel demand, and what role, if any, the existing petrol station network plays in the resulting electric charging infrastructure. Installing electric vehicle charging points at existing petrol stations seems, on the surface, like an obvious adaptation strategy, and a growing number of stations, both company-owned and independent, have begun doing exactly this. But the economics of EV charging are genuinely, fundamentally different from the economics of fuel dispensing in ways that create real challenges for station owners. A typical petrol fill-up takes 3 to 5 minutes. An EV fast charge, even on the most powerful currently available chargers, takes 20 to 40 minutes at minimum. Meaning the throughput model that has sustained petrol station economics for decades. High volume, rapid turnover, thin margin per transaction, does not translate directly to EV charging at all. The station needs to provide something for the driver to do during that 20 to 40 minute wait, which potentially enhances the shop and food to go opportunity, but also requires space, facilities, and investment that the existing site layout may not easily accommodate. The capital cost of installing high-powered charging equipment is substantial. The grid connection upgrades required to supply the necessary electrical capacity can be genuinely enormous, depending on the site's existing supply. And the revenue model for EV charging. Who sets the price? What margin the site operator earns, how the capital investment is recovered, is still evolving and still genuinely uncertain. For an independent station owner contemplating a significant capital investment in charging infrastructure, the risk calculation is genuinely daunting. Invest too early, and you may install equipment that becomes technologically obsolete before the investment is recovered. Invest too late, and you may find the EV charging market has been captured by dedicated charging networks, by supermarkets adding chargers to their car parks, or by the growing infrastructure of home and workplace charging that may reduce the need for public forecourt charging altogether. This strategic uncertainty, layered on top of all the existing margin, competitive and regulatory pressures this breakdown has documented, makes the current moment a genuinely pivotal, genuinely difficult one for independent petrol station owners across Britain. There is a property value dimension that is worth understanding clearly, because for many independent station owners, particularly those who acquired their sites decades ago when property values were considerably lower, the land the station sits on may actually be worth more as a development site for housing, retail, or other uses than it is as a continuing petrol station business. This creates a genuine, rational economic incentive to close the station and sell or develop the site for alternative use. An incentive that has already contributed to a significant number of station closures, particularly in urban and suburban areas where land values have appreciated substantially. The irony is real and worth naming directly. A business that is struggling to generate adequate returns from its actual trading operation may be sitting on a piece of land worth considerably more than the business itself, meaning the most financially rational decision for the owner may be to cease trading entirely. A decision that is individually rational but collectively damaging to the fuel retail infrastructure that the community, and particularly those without easy access to alternative stations, depends on. Now, let us put all of this together and look at what the economics of owning a UK petrol station actually look like, in honest, structural terms. The fuel operation, that enormous headline revenue figure flowing through the pumps, generates a margin so thin that it cannot, on its own, sustain the business. The shop operation, historically treated as an afterthought, has become the actual primary profit center, the thing that determines whether the business survives. The competitive environment is dominated by supermarket operators who can and do use fuel as a loss leader, creating pricing pressure no independent can sustainably match. The capital requirements for maintaining, upgrading, and eventually adapting the physical infrastructure are substantial and ongoing. The environmental liabilities are real, potentially enormous, and difficult to quantify precisely. The regulatory and compliance burden is heavy and disproportionately costly for smaller operators. And the electric vehicle transition is approaching with a speed and certainty that fundamentally questions the long-term viability of the core fuel dispensing operation around which the entire business model has been built for over a century. So if you are looking at a petrol station from the roadside and seeing a high turnover, seemingly straightforward business, remember what is actually underneath. The owner of that station, if it is genuinely independently owned at all, is managing a business where the primary product generates almost no margin, where the real profit comes from the sandwich cabinet and the coffee machine, where the competitive pressures are set by opponents with fundamentally different, structurally advantaged business models, where the capital demands are relentless and the environmental liabilities are genuine, and where the single biggest strategic question facing the business, how to navigate the transition away from the very product the entire operation was built to sell, remains genuinely, profoundly unresolved. That is the real economics of owning a UK petrol station, and it is considerably more complex, considerably more precarious, and considerably more structurally fascinating than almost anyone who simply pulls in, fills up, and drives away will ever realize. If this breakdown helped you see the real structure behind an industry you thought you already understood, subscribe to Money Framework British right now. Turn on notifications and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because this is exactly the kind of analysis this channel is built to deliver, and the next one goes just as deep.